Nick Reiner, the son of legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner, has reportedly been taken off suicide watch just days before his first court hearing. And that decision raises far more questions than it answers. Not because of speculation, not because of assumptions, but because of what usually has to happen before jail authorities make that call. Behind the scenes, there's a process most people never see, involving mental health evaluations, observation housing, and risk assessments that don't follow public opinion or headlines. And once you understand that process, the story looks very different. Let's start with what is confirmed. According to publicly available information and reporting from People magazine, Nick Reiner, 32 years old, remains in custody at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility in Los Angeles. He is facing 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, which reportedly occurred on December 14th at their Brentwood home. Shortly after his arrest, Nick was placed on suicide watch, a standard safety protocol used when authorities believe an individual may be at risk of self-harm while in custody. That status is not a punishment, it's a precaution. In those situations, inmates are typically placed in high observation housing, kept isolated, and provided clothing designed to reduce self-harm risk. And for weeks, that was Nick Reiner's status. Until now. So what changed, and who decides when someone comes off suicide watch? Sources within the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department told people that Nick has now been removed from suicide watch. He is reportedly wearing standard jail-issued clothing, a yellow shirt and blue pants, and remains in high observation housing, where he is still closely monitored and housed alone. This detail matters, because coming off suicide watch does not mean someone is considered low risk overall. It means jail mental health professionals have determined that at this moment, the individual no longer meets the criteria for that specific level of intervention. That decision is typically based on continuous observation, mental health evaluations, and behavioral assessments, not public pressure or court schedules. And that distinction often gets lost in online discussions. But this isn't the first time authorities have had concerns about Nick Reiner's mental health. And that history adds another layer to this case. According to past interviews and court-adjacent reporting, Nick Reiner has previously been treated for schizophrenia, a mental illness that is frequently misunderstood and often misrepresented in public discourse. Medical professionals emphasize that schizophrenia presents differently in each individual and does not, by itself, predict violent behavior. However, in custody settings, any documented mental health history is taken seriously. Records also indicate that while Nick was living with his parents, police had responded to welfare check calls involving him as far back as 2019. Again, these are not conclusions. They are documented interactions referenced in reporting, and they help explain why jail officials initially placed him under enhanced supervision after his arrest. So if authorities were previously concerned enough to place him on suicide watch, why remove it now, right before his arraignment? Nick Reiner is scheduled to be arraigned on January 7th at the Los Angeles Superior Court Stanley Moss Courthouse. At an arraignment, charges are formally presented, and a defendant enters a plea. It's often one of the most psychologically intense moments in a criminal case. That's why suicide watch decisions ahead of hearings are rarely made lightly. According to law enforcement sources cited in multiple outlets, Nick remains under the supervision of the jail's mental evaluation team, meaning monitoring has not stopped, only shifted. He is still housed separately, still observed closely, and still subject to court-ordered changes at any time. In other words, this is not a sign that the case is calming down. It's a sign that authorities believe he is currently stable enough to proceed, under controlled conditions. But the legal strategy unfolding behind the scenes may be just as important as the mental health evaluations. And that brings us to the attorney now representing Nick Reiner. Nick Reiner is being represented by Alan Jackson, a name that carries significant weight in high-profile criminal defense. Jackson is widely known for handling complex cases that attract intense public attention, including securing an acquittal in a widely followed murder trial in Massachusetts in 2022. That choice alone signals something important. High-profile defense attorneys typically step in when a case is expected to involve extensive pretrial motions, mental health evaluations, and detailed scrutiny of investigative procedures. In other words, this is not shaping up to be a straightforward courtroom process. But legal strategy is only one part of this story, because the personal history inside the Reiner household adds a layer most headlines barely touch. Years before these charges, Nick and his father openly discussed their complicated relationship, not in court, but through art. In 2016, Rob Reiner directed Being Charlie, a film co-written by Nick himself. The project explored addiction, recovery, and strained family dynamics, themes drawn from Nick's real-life struggles. In interviews at the time, Rob Reiner described the film as something that forced both of them to confront uncomfortable truths. He said the process helped them understand each other in ways they hadn't before. Those statements matter now, not as evidence, but as context. They paint a picture of a family that had already been navigating long-term challenges, privately and publicly, for years. And Nick himself had been unusually open about those struggles. In a 2016 interview with People magazine, Nick Reiner revealed that by age 22, he had been through rehabilitation programs 17 times. He described repeated ultimatums from his family: seek treatment or leave home. At times, he chose to leave. Nick spoke candidly about experiencing homelessness in multiple states, including Texas, New Jersey, and Maine. He described those periods not as dramatic turning points, but as harsh realities, consequences of choices made during active addiction. These admissions were voluntary, public, and years removed from the current case. But they help explain why law enforcement and mental health professionals would approach his custody status with heightened caution. Still, nothing about that past automatically explains what prosecutors are now alleging. And that gap between history and accusation is where much of the public confusion lives. According to charging documents referenced by multiple outlets, Nick Reiner is facing 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with a special allegation involving a knife. Details beyond that have been deliberately limited by authorities. And that restraint is intentional. In early stages of cases like this, prosecutors often avoid releasing extensive specifics to protect the integrity of the legal process, potential jury pools, and ongoing evaluations. It's also why responsible reporting uses protective language. Allegedly, according to sources, and based on publicly available records. At this stage, the court has not ruled on guilt or innocence. What has been established is that the case will involve careful examination of mental health history, forensic evidence, and procedural decisions made immediately after the deaths were discovered. According to reporting from the New York Times, Rob Reiner's daughter, Romy Reiner, discovered her father after a massage therapist scheduled to work at the home was unable to gain entry. First responders were called. Michelle Reiner was later found, and Romy was informed of the situation by authorities. This detail matters because it establishes a clear, documented timeline, one that investigators will rely on heavily as the case proceeds. It also reinforces why law enforcement has been methodical in how information is released. When a case intersects with public figures, family members, and ongoing legal rights, every word matters. And the way those deaths were discovered adds another quiet but significant detail. So where does that leave Nick Reiner right now? As of now, Nick remains in high observation housing. He is not free. He is not unmonitored. And his custody status can change at any moment by court order. Being taken off suicide watch does not mean the system has moved on. It means jail officials believe, based on professional evaluation, that he can safely participate in upcoming legal proceedings under structured supervision. That distinction is subtle, but crucial, and misunderstanding it has fueled much of the online speculation surrounding this case. But the biggest questions aren't about jail protocol. They're about what happens next, and how the court will navigate mental health, responsibility, and evidence in a case this complex. Cases like this rarely turn on a single moment. They unfold slowly through evaluations, hearings, motions, and decisions that happen far away from cameras and comment sections. In Nick Reiner's situation, the court is expected to examine not just what allegedly happened, but how the legal system should respond when serious charges intersect with documented mental health history. That process is deliberate by design, Mental health assessments may be ordered, expert testimony may be introduced. Procedural decisions will likely take months, not days, and none of that happens in a vacuum. Because the most difficult part of this case isn't proving timelines. It's determining responsibility within a complex human context. Public conversation often rushes toward conclusions. The legal system does the opposite. Judges and attorneys are tasked with separating emotion from evidence and speculation from verified fact. That's especially true when public figures are involved and when deeply personal family histories are pulled into public view. In this case, every step forward will be constrained by rules designed to protect due process, even when the circumstances are painful and confusing. That restraint can feel unsatisfying, but it exists for a reason. And that's why this story isn't really about one custody update. The decision to remove Nick Reiner from Suicide Watch isn't a verdict. It isn't a signal of leniency. It's a procedural assessment. One moment in a long legal process that prioritizes safety, stability, and the ability to proceed fairly. Understanding that helps reframe the narrative. Instead of asking what it means emotionally, the more accurate question is, what does it tell us about how the system operates when the stakes are this high? One aspect of this case that has received far less attention is how correctional facilities decide between suicide watch and high observation housing, and why that distinction matters legally. Suicide watch is typically triggered by immediate indicators of self-harm risk, statements, behavior, or acute psychological distress observed during intake or early custody. High observation. Housing, on the other hand, is designed for individuals who still require isolation and continuous monitoring, but who no longer meet the threshold for emergency intervention. Nick Reiner's current placement suggests that officials believe he is stable enough to function within structured confinement, while still requiring constant oversight. That balance is rarely accidental, and that balance becomes even more important once attorneys begin preparing for court. Defense teams in cases involving serious charges often track custody conditions closely, not because jail status determines guilt, but because it can influence competency evaluations, attorney-client communication, and pretrial strategy. Competency is a legal concept, not a medical diagnosis. It asks a narrow question. Can the defendant understand the proceedings and assist in their own defense? Being on suicide watch can sometimes delay that process, as courts may wait until an individual is considered mentally stable enough to participate meaningfully. Removal from suicide watch can therefore signal that the court process is ready to move forward, even if the broader case remains complex. And complexity is the defining feature of this case. Mental illness, substance use history, and criminal responsibility are often discussed together, but legally they are evaluated separately. A documented mental health condition does not automatically excuse alleged criminal conduct. At the same time, courts are obligated to consider whether such conditions affect intent, perception, or decision-making, depending on the legal arguments presented. That's why prosecutors and defense attorneys tend to proceed cautiously in cases like this. Every motion filed, every evaluation ordered, and every hearing scheduled can shape the outcome long before a trial ever begins. And that slow pace often frustrates the public. Public attention tends to spike around arrests and charges, then fade during the quiet procedural months that follow. But those quieter periods are when the most consequential decisions are made. Judges review reports that never make headlines. Attorneys negotiate boundaries on what evidence can be introduced. Experts prepare opinions that may later shape jury instructions. In Nick Reiner's case, that process is happening against the backdrop of extraordinary visibility, a factor courts are acutely aware of. High-profile cases demand not faster justice, but more careful justice. And that care extends to how information is released, or withheld. So far, authorities have released minimal detail about the alleged events themselves. This restraint is consistent with cases that may involve forensic reconstruction, psychiatric evaluation, and multiple expert witnesses. Early overdisclosure can complicate proceedings, especially when defense teams may argue prejudice or compromise due process. As a result, what the public knows is only a fraction of what investigators and attorneys are reviewing behind closed doors. That gap often fuels speculation, but it also protects the integrity of the case. Which raises a difficult question. How should the public interpret updates like this one? The removal of Suicide Watch is not a turning point in the narrative most people expect. It doesn't suggest improvement, deterioration, or outcome. It suggests transition. A shift from emergency stabilization to sustained legal process. That distinction matters because it reframes how future updates should be understood. Custody changes are administrative. Court rulings are procedural. Neither equates to resolution. And resolution, in cases like this, is rarely clean or fast. Another often overlooked factor is how families connected to high-profile defendants experience these proceedings. While the legal system focuses on charges and defenses, extended family members navigate public scrutiny while having little control over the narrative. In this case, very few public statements have been made by relatives, a choice that aligns with legal advice commonly given during ongoing proceedings. Silence in these moments is not avoidance. It's strategy, and strategy will continue to define every step forward. As the arraignment approaches, several outcomes remain possible. All procedural, none determinative. The court may set timelines for evaluations, schedule future hearings, or address custody and observation status. Each decision will build incrementally toward a broader legal framework that governs how the case proceeds. No single hearing will answer the biggest questions. Those answers emerge only over time, which is why this case resists simple storytelling. It's tempting to reduce events like this to labels: tragedy, downfall, scandal. But the reality unfolding here is more restrained, more bureaucratic, and more human than that. It involves systems designed to handle worst-case scenarios without inflaming them. Mental health professionals, correctional staff, judges, and attorneys are all operating within defined limits, even as public attention pushes for clarity. Understanding that tension is key to understanding the story itself. As new information emerges, it will likely come in fragments. A court filing here, a custody update there, a ruling buried deep in legal reporting. Each piece will matter, but none should be read in isolation, because cases like this are not built on moments. They are built on accumulation. One more element shaping this case is something rarely discussed outside legal circles: pretrial visibility management. In high-profile cases, courts and attorneys often anticipate how information will circulate, not to control opinion, but to prevent it from interfering with legal standards. That's why updates like custody status changes are released sparingly and without interpretation. The system assumes the public will fill gaps with assumptions. Its job is to make sure those assumptions don't influence outcomes. And that's especially critical when mental health is part of the record. Mental health history in criminal proceedings is not a single argument. It's a framework. Depending on how the defense proceeds, it can be relevant to competency to stand trial intent at the time of the alleged offense or sentencing considerations later on. Each of those questions operates under different legal standards. They are evaluated separately by different experts at different stages of the process. That's one reason why early reporting often feels incomplete, because legally it is. And that incompleteness is not accidental. Courts are cautious about allowing early narratives to harden. Once a storyline takes hold publicly, it can complicate jury selection, pretrial motions, and even appellate issues years later. That's why judges sometimes issue gag orders, why attorneys limit statements, why official language remains dry and procedural. In cases like this, restraint is not a lack of transparency. It's a form of protection for everyone involved, which makes every small update feel bigger than it actually is. The phrase, "taken off suicide watch," carries emotional weight. But operationally, it's closer to a checkbox than a turning point. It reflects an internal assessment, revisited regularly, and subject to reversal at any time. If conditions change, the status changes. No press release required. Understanding that helps contextualize future developments, especially if custody conditions shift again. And shifts are common in long-running cases. As weeks turn into months, attention often moves elsewhere. But the legal process doesn't slow down. Behind the scenes, reports are drafted, evaluations are reviewed, procedural timelines are negotiated. These steps rarely produce dramatic headlines, but They determine what evidence juries may eventually see and what they never will. In many cases, the outcome is shaped more by these early decisions than by anything said in open court. And that's where experienced legal teams focus their energy. High-profile defense attorneys are often associated with courtroom moments, cross-examinations, arguments, verdicts, but much of their influence happens earlier, through filings and strategy sessions that never make the news. In a case like this, decisions about when to request evaluations, how to frame prior history, and what motions to file can quietly define the boundaries of the trial itself. Those choices take time and patience, which again brings us back to timing. Public expectation often assumes momentum: arrest, charge, trial, verdict. Reality is far less linear. There may be pauses, delays, adjournments. Each one serves a purpose, even if it's frustrating to watch from the outside. The legal system prioritizes accuracy over speed, especially when irreversible outcomes are possible. What this case ultimately shows is not a single decision, update, or headline, but how slowly and deliberately the legal system moves when the stakes are this high. Custody status changes, mental health evaluations, and court procedures are not signals of outcome. They are signals of process. Understanding that difference is essential, especially in cases where public attention can easily outpace verified information. As this story continues, clarity won't come from speculation, but from how evidence, expert assessments, and legal standards intersect over time. In the next video, we'll focus on what actually happens after an arraignment, why cases involving mental health often unfold behind the closed doors, and how early procedural decisions can quietly shape everything that follows. That's where the next chapter begins.